Welcome back to another episode of the CSKA podcast. My name is Jared O'Leary. Each week of this podcast is either a solo episode where I unpack some scholarship or an interview with a guest or multiple guests to discuss computer science education. This week's particular interview is with James Fester, and in our conversation, we discuss using informal learning approaches within formal learning spaces, what makes a learning experience engaging, how James's experience in the National Park Service's Teacher Ranger Teacher program informed how he taught in the classroom. We unpack some nuances of project-based learning, as well as debunk some of the common misconceptions of PBL, and so much more. There are several publications, podcasts, and other forms of media that are mentioned in this interview, and you can find those in the show notes at jaredoleary.com, or by simply clicking the link in the app that you're listening to this on. While you're checking out the show notes, make sure you check out the Coding and CS Content tab at the top of my website, which has links to hundreds, if not thousands of more resources, including the free curriculum that I create for Boot Up PD, which you can find at bootuppd.org. But with all that being said, we will now begin with the interview with James.
Okay, my name is James Fester. I am an educator, author, and consultant who currently lives in the Twin Cities area of Minnesota. I started out as a public school teacher working in California, where I was mostly working at the secondary level until I transitioned into a role as an instructional coach. And then just a few years ago, I moved to the St. Paul area, working primarily in educational technology for the first 4 years at an independent school, and then gradually transitioned into a full-time role with an organization called PBL Works, which is really well known for all of the work that they do in the project-based learning area. I worked for them primarily part-time up until very recently, and have since switched over to a full-time position working with teachers predominantly in the New England and Great Lakes regions, just helping schools and teachers build their capacity for student-centered project-based learning. Outside of all of that work, I also work out with a couple of other educational agencies. I'm a National Geographic grantee. I do a lot of work with the National Park Service as a volunteer interpreter and educational curriculum developer for a bunch of different parks across the country. And probably most exciting, I have recently published an amazing book with my good friend and co-author, George Valenzuela, on how to use PBL as a vehicle to teach environmental science. And it is published by ISTE and has just been released for pre-sale and publication, which we're both very excited about getting to share that work with other people as well.
That's awesome. So I've had a variety of different publication collaborations with other individuals. I'm curious, what's something that you learned through that process of creating a book?
That's a really great question. One thing that I definitely learned, and my co-author George was a really big help with this, because he had been a published author when we got to do this project together. And one thing that I learned was the importance of setting aside time, like a consistent time for writing. As somebody who's a developing writer, sometimes I would, inspiration strikes at weird times. But if you don't have that happen, then you're stuck kind of just waiting for something to come across. And so unless you give yourself specific time during a time of the day that works well for you as a writer, you're not going to be able to keep up with either a schedule that you have or some deadlines that may be coming up. And so I turned out, and this was never the case for me when I was, in college or even first starting out in teaching, never a morning person. And I have recently become one where the first couple of hours after I wake up and go through my morning routine are the most productive for me. And that's when I generally tend to do all of my writing. It took me a little time to find that out. And so I feel like that's good advice for other people, is be open to knowing that you do have certain times of the day that you may be more productive as a writer, and try to figure out what those are so that you can consistently hit those as you go forward with different projects you're working on.
Yeah, I like that. That definitely resonates with a lot of advice that I've heard from other productivity people, is make it so that your morning time is the thing that you need to dive deepest on, or requires the highest cognitive load or energy.
I was going to say, one thing that I learned, especially having many, many other people, I'm sure, working from home, is don't stay in your pajamas all day. Actually transition. And it's funny because when I thought about when I was traveling to my school site, when I was still working at a school full time, I would get up, I would get dressed, I would, brush my teeth, have a shower, maybe not in that order. And then I would drive to work. And there was that transition that I had from I'm at home to I'm at work. And it really did help. And a lot of what I've read about from productivity people is the same thing, is you have to still provide that transition time, the transition from I'm at home, even though I'm going to be at home the whole time, to I'm at my working part and then back again. So that's something that I learned and got a lot of advice from people who had been working home long before it became the thing to do, is don't work in your pajamas, because it really does mess with your productivity and the way your brain works, which I thought was interesting.
Yeah, I like that, setting that habit and whatnot. One of the things that I would do is I'd flip my monitors. So I have two monitors. One is straight on and then another is at an angle. And I would flip which one was which when I would switch to like my leisure time versus my, okay, now I'm working on like creating curriculum time. That helped me at least.
Like physically rearranging your workspace. That's a cool idea. I like that.
So if we zoom out a bit and talk about just like education as a whole, can you tell me a story about an experience in education that had an impact on you?
My educational journey has been kind of unique in the sense that I've existed both in the classroom environment, but also in what's mostly called the informal environment. So I am the son of two career public school teachers. I grew up understanding a lot of that life. I grew up, going to work with my dad and sitting in the front of his classroom and distracting his students horribly when I was younger, or hearing about the things that were great and the things that were struggles for them when they would come home from work when I was getting older. So I knew that world very well. But equally well was another world where it was more informal education. So we're talking about, when you go to a museum, when you go to a national park, when you go to a nature center or go on a hike, and there's those little interpretive panels on the side of the trail. Not a classroom environment, but still an environment where you are learning actively. And I kind of have experience in both of those areas. And they always kind of existed separately. Like, I had my classroom gig, and then on the weekends, I would go and do my volunteer work at the state park or the national park when I was living in the San Francisco Bay Area. About my second year of teaching, my principal at the time decided it would be a really great idea for me to teach sixth grade science. I had never taught sixth grade science before. This was brand new, but he was trying to keep me at the school and fill out my schedule. So I wasn't going to complain because I wanted to keep my job. And he gave me this class, and I taught it very much like I had been taught, especially in college. Like, here's your lectures, here's your videos, here's your quizzes. I taught the way that it worked for me in a classroom because that's where I was. Then on the weekends, I would go and I would do these very experiential, audience-focused, facilitated, guided programs working for the State Park Service. And I never put the two together until I had this one student who one day, just in the middle of my class, threw her hands up in the air and just said, I can't do this anymore, and slammed her, head down on her desk. She just gave up. And I went over and I said, Ashley, I'm sorry to hear you're frustrated. I'm getting that loud and clear by the way that you just chucked your notebook across the room and are now head down and ignoring me. But what's going on? Is there something going on? And she said, I just don't understand why we're learning this. Why does this matter? And I was like, well, the subject we're talking about in this case, it was estuaries and rivers, how they flow into oceans. Like the watershed is what we were looking at. We were looking at the watershed we live in. And I was talking about how important it is to understand the environment, because then we can understand our impact. And I started basically pulling, without really knowing it, pulling stuff from that guided nature talk that I had just given that previous weekend on Angel Island, where I was up with a group and we were talking about all of the different estuaries and tidal influence and all these things. And I kind of went into what I called park ranger mode. And then at the end of my little chat, she looks up at me and she gives me this look and she's like, well, why didn't you just say that instead of making us take all these stupid notes? And that became a moment for me where I said, well, why don't I do that? Why am I not bringing these things that I do in an informal setting into a classroom? Because it's all education and it might work better for some of these students. And so that really kind of brought me around. I came to this conclusion early on in my career, thankfully, thanks to this interaction with a student, but you can't just teach the way you were taught. You cannot just teach or instruct in the way that works for you, because it's not going to work for all of your students. You need to mix it up. You need to think about different ways of bringing them to this knowledge and helping them develop their understanding. And I know for some people, this is elementary stuff, but for me, it was this big aha moment that I have this entire set of tools that I use on the weekend to great effect that I can be bringing in. And so a lot of the work that I do now is trying to bridge the gap between what happens in these informal spaces and what happens in these formal classroom spaces, and where are the connections. So that for me, that was like kind of a big moment that's impacted and really kind of changed the trajectory of a lot of the work that I even do today.
So let's double click on that. So what comes to mind when you think of an engaging learning experience?
So immediately the things that come to mind is the focus is not on the teacher, the focus is on the student. That's very broad. Now, what does that mean? It was very easy for me also because I really enjoyed lectures. I really enjoyed an engaging speaker. That was the way that I learned best. If the person that I was listening to was engaging, was knowledgeable, the subject was interesting, I was their hook, line, and sinker. But in that situation, it's a very standard or very old school classroom model, traditional classroom model, whatever you want to call it, where The instructor controls what goes on in the classroom. They are the focus of the lesson, they're the focus of the learning, and they're imparting this knowledge onto the students. Now, if we flip that on its side, where instead of being the focus of the classroom, you as the instructor are helping to guide the students towards their own learning, it definitely feels different. In some ways, it can feel more chaotic. It feels maybe even like more stressful because now you are no longer keeping the focus and keeping the reins tight on these students, that you're trying to also manage behavior. You're also trying to keep them on task. You're trying to give remedial support to students who may need it one more time. It feels different. It feels more chaotic, but ultimately it's much better for the students, because at the end of the day, in my opinion, the one thing that we want all students in K-12 education to leave with is being able to understand how to continue their education when they're no longer in a classroom.
Right.
We want to develop them as lifelong learners so they can solve their own problems. They can figure out what they need. They can go on, and whatever the problem is, if it's rewiring an electrical socket or trying to finish their master's thesis, they know what they need to do absent that guiding presence to continue their education and learn. And so for me, that's really what it boils down to: is where's the focus of the instruction? Is it on the teacher imparting the knowledge, or is it on the student and the teacher is facilitating them getting that knowledge themselves?
So what is guiding that learning process? Like, is it through inquiry? Is it through projects? Like, what does that look like for you, ideally?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of different ways that you can do it. For me, just because of the way that I was trained and the tool set that I brought into the classroom, for me, it really is inquiry-based projects. Project-based learning for me, it's a method of teaching where students are basically using inquiry to move themselves through this process of eventually answering this challenging question with an authentic, real-world product that is presented publicly, or is useful to somebody outside of the classroom. So it is that whole process of, here is our big challenge, here is our question, here's our overarching driving focus for this project. What do we need to know in order to do this? Because we're in this together. It's not just you guys learning and me sitting back here. It's an active learning process that the teacher is involved in as well. And we're all going to do it together. I am bringing you this problem. What do you need to know in order to solve it? Is it you need to gain some knowledge with these different content standards? Is it that there's a skill that maybe you need to learn more about? Is there a tech tool I need to go out, find, and we need to figure out how to use together? What are we going to do? And it is inquiry that basically leads you through that process and ends with that final authentic product. So for me, at least, an inquiry-based project process is definitely the answer to your question.
So you said previously that lectures worked for you, like it worked really well for you, you really enjoyed it. So how did you learn how to facilitate in this way? So letting inquiry guide your process. Like when you went to the classroom, when you first started, it sounded like you were repeating what worked really well for you. But on the weekends, you were doing something very different. So how did you learn how to do that thing that was different?
Luckily, I had a lot of experiences in those kinds of more informal methodologies. When you go to, let's say, a state or a national park and there's a ranger, with a Smokey the Bear hat, and they're talking to you about plate tectonics or glaciers or the critters that live in the forest and teaching you all about those. That method is called interpretation. And it basically uses questions, dialogue, and provocations to help learners basically connect to whatever resources they're using for educational purposes that they might be interested in. And it's really important that you're creating, instead of saying like, this is what we're doing and we're following this path. I may have an overarching idea of where we're going, but we all are going to get there in this different way. We may engage with different parts of this. There may be one part of this program that you're more interested in that you want to follow, and that's okay, because eventually we're all going to get to the same place. That approach informed a lot of what I did in the classroom. So it wasn't so much that I was relearning how to teach. It was just that I had to be open to figuring out, okay, well, what is this going to look like in a classroom space when I don't have a tree or a lake or a fuzzy wuzzy to point at? How do I bring those resources in a way that students can utilize them? For some of my students, it was going to be love of the subject that turns them on and connects them. For some, it's just wanting to get a good grade. For some of them, it's wanting to be a part of a classroom community where they're, liked by their peers and we have a good working relationship. For some students, none of those things are what it is. And for that, it really needs to be, okay, well, how do you want to go about this? Or what's a good way that your voice can be represented in what we're doing? Is it better for you to do it this way, or this way when I'm asking for you to demonstrate your knowledge of this particular learning goal? Giving them more ownership, giving them more choice, that was the engagement that they needed. And that worked for them. And so that's why I really needed to bring in some of those outside tools into my classroom so that they could really find the method that worked best for them.
Yeah, that reminds me a lot of So there's a professor that I happen to take a class with, and I've read several of his books. His name is James Paul Gee. And so he talks frequently about how video games, like as a genre of entertainment, needed to be inherently engaging and interesting. Otherwise, people would just leave. Like they would not play that game. The way that he would frame it is in relation to education, which resonates really well, it sounds like, with what you're just describing. So if you're a park ranger and you are not engaging somebody in their interest, then they're just going to walk away. They're going to leave. And okay, now you got to try this again with the next person, and you try and find new ways. But in a classroom, you don't really have that ability because students are required to be there. Even if they absolutely hate the subject or hate the teacher who's facilitating or teaching it, they're still required to be there. So a teacher can fail year after year and not necessarily improve on how they're engaging students because the students don't have that ability to walk away. Now, if they did, on the other hand, then that would be like give a lot of feedback for the teacher, both positive and negative, in terms of what they're doing well and what they could work on. So it's really interesting the way that you're framing that. And like, as somebody who formalized education worked really well for me, like I enjoyed it. I was that kind of a kid. But once I realized that what I was doing in informal spaces could inform what I was doing in formal spaces, and I had to treat it differently when students were required to be in a class versus they signed up for it versus like they're paying a lot of money to be in it. Like those are all different groups and approaches that you need to take.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting point. What you said is where students are required to be there. There are certain requirements that, yes, like if I was out leading a hike in a beautiful state park and I said, okay, everybody, we're going to start this hike and everybody can gather around, people are free to come and go as they please. They're choosing to engage with that way of learning. They don't have to. They could go to the visitor center and look at exhibits. They could go and download an audio hike and lead themselves. There's no requirement for them to connect with me. So what am I going to do to keep their attention? But at the same time, yeah, the students are there. And I've had plenty of students that have been in my classroom as they are required to be and have chosen not to engage. And it's the same thing as them walking away halfway through my remarkable nature hike that I think I'm doing a great job at. But when I start to see them check out, just like in the classroom, I start to see my students, head down, or what the different body language that we can clue into that this is not working for them. In a way, it's the same thing. You cannot force a student to learn if they're not really interested. And even that, they may just say, okay, well, what's the bare minimum I have to do? Why should I try? I don't understand this. There's lots of things that they can do, even if they're not there. And some, sadly, choose just not to show up.
Right.
And that's another thing that I think about a lot is I know that the students that school works well for, the high achievers, they're going to do well at everything pretty much. They're always going to do well. Even the ones in the middle, depending on what day of the week it is, they're going to probably succeed really well. So I constantly have to ask myself, okay, what is it that my students who do not find as much success in the game of school need? Because if I can bring them up, that's a really good effort. So it's something that I found myself asking a lot is, okay, what is going to work really, really well for this particular student? Because I'll betcha that will help other students as well. It's something that I got recently turned on to by a colleague of mine was, I think it's actually called the curb cut theory. Curb cuts, those things that allow people to go from the sidewalk down to the street and back up again that are really, really important. They were developed for people in wheelchairs because without that, they can't get up from the street to the sidewalk when they're crossing the street. But think about all the other people that use them. We have people that are, Amazon employees with dollies that use them. We have people on bikes and skateboards. We have mothers and fathers pushing strollers. All sorts of people use that scaffold that was not meant for them. That's kind of the same thing as, okay, who in your classroom is your, call him an extreme user, I think is the terminology used. Who is the person who is going to require the most support in order to overcome some of these challenges or be able to participate in this lesson? Think about them. What do they need? What assets do they bring to the classroom first and foremost? Because you always want to start from an asset-based state of mind. But what are the challenges they're going to encounter that you might need to plan for, because those are going to create pathways for everybody else in the same place. And so that's I think that's a really smart way of thinking about scaffolding, especially if you're stressed out by all of the different needs in your classroom. Who's the extreme user, the one that you think is going to require the most support? How can you bring them in through interests, strengths, or addressing challenges? And that'll help kind of bring the rest of the group up too.
Yeah, that actually reminds me of, I was at the Worldwide Developers Conference for Apple. I think this was like 2017. And one of the things they highlighted was we design for the extreme users, for the end cases when it comes to disability, because then it affects everybody positively. And I thought that was a really smart way of doing it. They had a blind DJ perform for the conference and was using the interface, and it was showing like how while they were manipulating the things, it would like read off like what it was that they were manipulating so they could hear it, so that way they could then actually manipulate the screen and whatnot. So really good idea.
Yeah. And it's really amazing when you start to look at all of the different things that have been designed for people with exceptional needs that we now take for granted. I mean, texting, that was originally for people that were hearing impaired that needed that textual readout so that they could communicate through phones and things like that. And now I know among certain generations, it's the predominant method of communication. And where would we be without it if we weren't doing exactly what you're saying? What are these different things that we're creating, these pathways that we're creating for other people that are then utilized by so many others of us as well?
Now, I'm wondering if we could dive deeper into what you're discussing with like project-based learning. So you mentioned that inquiry will kind of guide the exploration of answering a question or solving a problem, etc. Project-based learning can mean many different things depending on who is saying it and in what context. So it could be like a backwards design model like Wiggins and McTighe. It could be more open, inquiry-driven model. Like there's many different flavors of PBL. I'm curious, can you elaborate on like what project-based learning looks like or means to you?
Yeah, I absolutely can. And then I got a great resource that I would love to share with everybody that's totally free that they can check out, because it is very true. Like when you say project-based learning, you got to be very cognizant. Okay, what exactly does that mean? What you're doing or what you say you're doing is project-based learning, because sometimes it's just doing projects. And I've worked with plenty of teachers who, when I started to talk about project-based learning, they say, oh yeah, I do that all the time. And then when we really dive deep into what they're actually doing, what their pedagogy is, that there are some things that are missing that are really emblematic of a tried and true PBL model. So some things that I would probably say right off the top is that it has to be based around learning goals or content standards that the students need to learn anyways. You shouldn't be just doing projects for the sake of doing projects. They should be focused on creating authentic pathways or authentic applications of these content standards that were required by our states or governments or whatever it is to teach. It should be focused primarily around a driving question or a problem of some sort. Students should be involved in the management process and be building project management skills. They should be learning to communicate, collaborate, to problem solve, all these things that are going to translate to college and career readiness. There should be a demystification or an authentic connection to the content. They should never be in a classroom wondering, why on earth do we have to learn about this particular thing in this class? Like, why does this matter? There should be a clear, authentic application or a connection to somebody in the real world who is using the content they're learning to do their job. So they, at no point can they say like, well, this doesn't matter to anyone or this doesn't matter at all. It should also be something that the final product either is publicly presented or just matters to somebody outside of the classroom. So it could be something as simple as you're publishing your work online. It could be you're bringing in an authentic audience. Another thing that I think is really important is that outside expertise is brought in so that you are actually like reaching out either to the community or to different, educational institutions or whatever, to bring in people who can speak to students at a very expert level that maybe you as the teacher, not everything is your strong suit, but you can bring in somebody who that's what they do and they can talk to the students about how their learning matters so much. And then finally, reflection needs to be a part of it. There needs to be a reflective aspect to that entire process that works really well as a way of students kind of pausing, taking in what have they learned, considering what their next steps are or the impact and why is important what they're doing and where they go from there. All of those things said, because there are a lot of different people that do project-based learning. Like I work for PBL Works. I'm pretty biased that I think that our model that we use is really, really good. But a lot of other people agree with it as well. If you Google project-based learning, we're going to pop up pretty near the top for that reason. But there's lots of other people that are doing great stuff. Like the New Tech Network's got a great model. Project Lead the Way's got a great model. There's lots of people that are doing really great, high-quality PBL. And because there were so many different flavors, a while ago, all the big practitioners got together and they said, okay, let's just agree on what like every model has to have in order for it to actually be PBL. And they came up with something called the HQ PBL model. You can go on and Google, I think if you go to hqpbl.org, it'll pop up right away. And there are 6 elements that framework includes that 99% of the people that do PBL well out there agree should be included. They may have like 1 or 2 extra that they add on, but if you're looking for a place to get started or a resource to find out like, what am I doing in the classroom that is project-based learning and where are the areas that I can grow and become an even better practitioner, that's the first place that I would direct you. It's a free site. You can download the framework in English and Spanish. And it's a great way to kind of look for opportunities to extend your own learning while affirming the things you already know you're doing well.
And I'll make sure to include a link to that in the show notes. So let's say we had 30 kids in a classroom. I'm wondering if you could clarify, like, how many different questions or problems would you see in that particular class with 30 kids? And then who determines which questions and problems are going to be explored?
That's a really great question. There's a couple of different answers to it. I don't think there's necessarily just one right way. As a teacher who has facilitated PBL projects in a classroom that size, I can say that the overarching question, the driving question, the anchor question, whatever you want to call it, that's going to be the same for everyone because you want to have a focal point. And generally, that question, it's very open ended. It's also very focused on the standards, the learning goals, or the learning objectives in the course so that you can be ensured, like, even if we go off on tangents, which sometimes totally happens, we're all trying to aim for an answer to this question. And if we do that well, we will hit all of these learning goals that I, as a teacher, am required to make sure you leave this class with. So it's important to have some sort of consistency there. That's what I would say, like, okay, everybody, we're focused on this one. You may have more than one driving question or anchor question, depending on how long a project is, or if it's interdisciplinary. There's no rule against that. But those big ideas, those big questions, generally they're the same for everyone. It's to create some sort of anchoring focus that we're all going to keep coming back to. Outside of that, and again, depending on how comfortable you are with facilitating student learning and letting them have a lot of leeway or maybe not as much, and a lot of that kind of sometimes depends on the age of the student, because developmentally, students at certain ages, they might be a little bit more ready to kind of follow those independent inquiry processes themselves, while older students are pretty good at that. Younger ones sometimes need a little bit more structure, and there's nothing wrong with that. So part of that, what questions are we exploring and which are we not, may come down to the teacher determining developmentally what's best for the student or how many tangents they can handle. But ideally, what students would do is they would come up with a big old list of questions, of things they want to learn more about, of ideas they want to research. And through that inquiry process, what they would do is they would continually come back to that list. And soon they would realize, okay, there are some of these questions that actually they're not important, or it's not really going to contribute as much to answering that driving question. But some of these, as we're finding out, are very crucial, or we really need to know more about. They're more foundational. And those are the ones that you want to kind of facilitate, like some sort of process where they're, after they come up with the initial brainstorm or brain dump, whatever you want to call it, they're really kind of focusing on what are the big questions, the ones we really want to spend time on, and which ones are maybe tangential and not as important. And that is something that can be facilitated. There's lots of different ways of facilitating inquiry. One of the things that you can use is a process called the QFT, or question formulation technique. If you look that up, you can learn how to do that. It's a great way for getting students to be able to identify and prioritize more foundational, important questions and push past ones that are not as important. So that's one way of doing it, but there's a lot of different ways of coaching students towards those questions that you recognize as the teacher. Oh, okay, this one's really important. We better go for this. But it's a lot better if they explore that and discover that themselves. And sometimes it's, there's lots of different ways of doing it. The QFT is one of them, but there's many different ways of getting students to help figure out and prioritize those right ones.
Yeah, I like the nuance is in your answer that you had there. Like, having done projects with students, sometimes it's one project for the entire class. Sometimes it's, hey, pick a question among these like 5 choices, or sometimes it's, hey, there's 30 kids, you come up with 30 different questions or problems that you're interested in solving, and you can do that on your own. Really kind of depends on the context, like your own understanding, especially if you're a CS educator who's brand new and you're like, I just want to focus on one thing. That's very different than if you've been doing this for several years and are confident being able to facilitate several different projects at the same time. What about some misconceptions, though, that people often get with project-based learning?
Ooh, that's a good one. Okay, so one of the first ones that I want to say right off the top is that project-based learning doesn't mean that the teacher is never the focus of instruction in a classroom. There's this kind of myth out there that if I do PBL, that means I never get to lecture. That means that I never get to be the center of quote unquote attention or the focus in the classroom. And it's just everything is the students are doing it and I'm really kind of hands off. That's not true. There's plenty of things that a teacher should be doing. And there are plenty of opportunities for the teacher, who is the expert in the room, to really make sure that students understand certain things before they get launched into these independent inquiry processes. For example, the school that I used to work at, it was an independent school, and we had 43 different feeder schools. A lot of them were like tiny, 2-3 dozen student, religious schools. Some of them were Waldorf. Some of them, they came over and they were full on coding in multiple languages. And I got to do a lot of the introductory lessons for new students in technology. So I've got kids that are like ready to program the Hubble, and I got kids that don't know what a space bar is because they went to a Waldorf. And here I am. We can't just say, okay, guys, go have fun in the sixth grade.
Right.
They're not going to be successful, or some of them are going to be so crazy successful, they're going to get bored to tears. And so I want to make sure that my students, when they would come in, they had the basic level of knowledge, the basic level of understanding they needed to be successful in their classes with these technology tools. That is one of the times that I, as the teacher, was the center of instruction to make sure we're going to get you up to this level, and then you're going to be able to do all this stuff more or less on your own. I would say the same thing in a project-based classroom. You don't want students to not have the basic foundational knowledge, vocabulary understanding, because then okay, go research. Well, research what? If you don't understand the key terms or what certain vocabulary terms mean, how are you going to know to look for them if these resources are good to go? So that's one that I would say is the teacher does have a very active role. The other one I would say is that just having students work together in groups is not the same thing as helping them learn how to collaborate.
Yeah.
If you put students together in a group and there is not any kind of structure in place, you haven't provided them with tools to help them be successful as collaborators, they are going to fail. And you will have kind of inadvertently set them up for failure. And it's one of the reasons why I think PBL, which tends to be not necessarily always group products, but a lot of collaborative products are involved in a lot of PBL experiences, it gets a bad name because of that. Because the students instantly think of, well, if I put my students in groups, there's going to be this one kid who does nothing and this one kid who does everything. And then I'm not going to know who gets what grade. And it's like, well, but that's not something that has to happen if you are structuring group work correctly. Why can't you put them together and ask them to look at a collaboration rubric for what kinds of things you expect them to be doing? Why can't they, before they begin working in an unstructured work time session, list out the list of tasks they're going to be accomplishing that period and put their names next to the ones that they're going to work on to create some ownership over who's doing what? Why on earth, if you see that exact situation happening, a student not doing anything while his partners do everything, would you not intervene and say, hey, what's the problem here? Do you not understand? Are you not being included? Is there some sort of problem in this group? Or do you just need me to come over and remind you that you're expected to participate along? I think that that's another really big misconception. I think it kind of puts a bad taste in some people's mouth about PBL before they even really begin to understand that it's more than just group work. There's a lot of other aspects to it, but that one, I think, I don't know about you, but I definitely can think back to my high school and can think back to some really awful experiences I had working in a group where people like, hey, James, come work with us. And I'm like, oh man, they want to work with me. They wanted to work with me because they knew I was going to do the work. And they wanted to sit there and just goof around and doodle while I was putting together the research, bibliography. And knowing that, I don't want teachers to have to feel like that same thing is going to happen. I don't want that to transfer over to their students too.
Yeah, that definitely resonates. I had so many experiences that like group work is almost like a dirty word for me. I'm just like, oh no, I don't want to do that, because like I always feel held back or feel like people are just like pulling down the rest of the group just because it was bad collaboration. It wasn't really collaboration. Me and maybe one other person doing most of the work.
Yeah, exactly.
So one of the things that I like to do is think of counter arguments for things that I agree with or am very passionate about. So I'm curious, for you, I totally agree with what you've been saying with project-based learning, but when would you not use project-based learning?
One thing that's really good to point out is that doing PBL well does not mean that you have to be a wall-to-wall PBL school or that's all you do all of the time. You don't necessarily need to go from project to project to project to project, right? If you're familiar with High Tech High, the kind of flagship PBL school down in San Diego, they have these immersive, massive, semester-long interdisciplinary projects that just encompass, 5 different subjects, and they're huge. And that works really well for them. Their faculty has been doing it for a really long time. The students have bought into this is what you're going to do. They're really good at doing that, but that doesn't necessarily work for everyone. And I never did that because number one, that sounded exhausting to me. But number two, there were just some standards or some learning goals that I looked at that I was like, there is no project here. In social studies, for example, like I would look at what are the standards that really lend themselves to number one, inquiry, or I have the time to devote some exploratory inquiry time to. So if it's a standard that literally takes me normally 20 minutes to teach my way through. What am I going to do? Put together a 2-week project and then I'm totally thrown off. So that's one thing that I would say is consider the standards. If you look at them and you do not have the time to give your students the opportunity to explore them through inquiry, not a good one. You can sometimes find those kind of mismatchy standards or those shorter, narrower standards and bundle them together in a creative way to create those blocks of time. But by themselves, they shouldn't be a PBL by themselves. Not every standard is supposed to be that. The other one too is if you look at the standard of the learning goal and you ask yourself, who does this in the real world and what do they do with it to solve a problem or to, take care of something that they have to do in terms of their job? If you can't articulate those two things in your own head, you're going to have no success articulating that to a group of students who don't have the same expert level of knowledge you do. So that's another kind of red flag is maybe that's not the best way until you can authentically demonstrate why this standard is so important or how it's used in the real world. If you can't think of that yourself, then that's another kind of a no-go. That being said, just because not everything is a project in your room doesn't mean you cannot be doing the types of things you would be doing during a PBL experience all the time. You can always be encouraging students to reflect. You can always be helping them develop skills to help them become better collaborators and communicators. You can always be providing, facilitation style experiences where they're doing, little research sprints or getting into pairs or triples or whatever. You can always be doing those kinds of things that you do during a PBL project in your classroom, even if it's not building towards an authentic project that's going to be publicly shared or whatever else. So I think that would be what I would say in terms of when would I not do PBL.
Yeah, I really hope the listeners go back and honestly listen to that again. There were so many good points that you're just giving in there. I'm curious, what would you recommend for educators who want to learn more about this approach or project-based learning in general?
I mean, there's a bunch of websites I can direct them to. I would obviously direct them to shamelessly pblworks.org. We have lots of great resources, not just the workshops and stuff we provide, but really some of the best stuff that we have on our website comes in our blogs. We have great blog posts that have been written by not just members of our national faculty who are practitioners themselves with tons of experience. They're guest teachers that have been doing it for a long time that we've had the opportunity to work with that come on and they write about things specific, solution oriented. Here are strategies you can use to solve this problem. I would definitely encourage people to look at those things. I would definitely also encourage folks that are interested in learning more to find a PBL framework that they really like or that they think that they can then base their own approach off and then look at it, say, what am I already doing well? And what kinds of things have I not considered doing that can improve what I'm doing? So the PBL, the HQ PBL one is one. The Buck Institute gold standard PBL model is another one. But there are lots of ones like that because I think when people do that, what they're going to realize is if what's going on in your classroom is good teaching, then what's going on in your classroom is at least a lot of aspects probably of project-based learning. Because as you've heard me kind of describe what I think it is, I'm sure that a ton of the listeners are going, oh yeah, I do that. Oh, I do that all the time. Oh, well, I've always thought that made sense. And that's really been my experience is when I go into a training with a teacher who's never heard of PBL, but then I start to rattle off, well, these are some of the descriptors. Do you do this? Here's an example of what one looks like. They go, oh, I kind of do a lot of that. And then it just becomes, well, how do you do that? And we're going to rearrange some stuff. We're going to give you more opportunities to put more of the learning responsibilities on your students, and bing, bang, boom, you're suddenly, doing really high level, high quality PBL.
Right.
Yeah. And I think one more thing that I would say is there are lots and lots of people that share projects, great project ideas out there that you can then take and then adopt, but don't just try to copy what somebody else has done. Take what you can find, take their idea, and then think about, well, will this work for my students? Think about those extreme users. What do I need to do in order to make this more engaging or make this so that this student can be more successful? Because you really want to focus it. You want to make sure you've got a lot of student consideration in mind when you're doing those projects together. Very rarely will you find a project that you could literally print off, download, and do exactly like somebody else did it and hope for it to be exactly as successful. Always encourage people to be thinking about, well, your students better than the designer of this project. What do they need or what will they want? Or is there a completely different tangent you can go on that they're going to be really interested in based on their interests? So that's probably the other thing. Like find that framework, find a project you're passionate about or that you think is interesting, and then go ahead and try it and see what happens.
I like that. There's another potentially interconnected topic that I definitely want to dive into. I'm curious, can you describe what is SEL and why is this important for educators to know about?
I can. I'm going to do my best because my partner in crime, George, is the SEL expert, but I do know enough about it where I can talk a little bit about what it means to me and how it works in relationship to the work that I do. So SEL, or social emotional learning, basically it is helping students become more emotionally aware of their needs so that they can be more successful in classroom, in life, whatever it is. We know that the social emotional aspects, especially in a framework like PBL, you're going to be interacting with other students. You're going to come in on days that you're frustrated. Your group is going to be depending on you. How do you dial in to what you need or how you're feeling without it coming off as like, well, you're just negative and, oh, we hate having you in our group? Or if there's somebody else that you're working with on a project that starts snapping at you, what tools are you using as a person to stop and pause and say, is this really about me or is there something else going on? And I think that's why SEL is so important, at least in a PBL frame, because it does give students concrete strategies and concrete thinking maps to be able to use to dial into some of those things that can foul up a working relationship or the culture in the room. It's definitely important later on in life. I mean, I can't tell you the number of times as an adult, I've been in a social situation, talking to a friend of mine. I go up and see somebody I haven't seen for a while, like somebody that I work with. I go, hey, how are you doing, man? How's your day been? It's been a good day so far. And he turns around and snaps at me, what's so good about it? And I have to sit there and go, okay, I can either take that personally and I can just write off our relationship, or I can say, is it really about me? And I can say, hey, is something going on? And then that leads into me finding out that he, hit a deer on his way into work, which happens a lot in the Minnesota, Wisconsin area. It's a constant, hazard, deers running across things. But, I find out that his reaction, which I could have taken personally, has nothing to do with me. And SEL provides those tools to kind of deconstruct that whole thing and become more aware of his emotions, my emotions, and how the two are kind of playing together. So that's kind of my long-winded way of answering it, is that it's important, especially for the work that I'm doing and the work that I encourage other teachers to do in the PBL world, because so much of PBL is interpersonal, whether it's teacher, student, teacher, outside expert, that you really do need those strategies in order to be able to be the best facilitator, the best working partner, the best presenter you can be for the other people in the room that are depending on.
Let's dive deeper into that. So the last year and a half in particular has been really rough on educators, but in general, it's a very hard field. There's a very high burnout rate, and it's just in general difficult. So what are some strategies or tools or tactics that you use to try and prevent the burnout that can come with working in education?
There are a couple of ones that I think are really important. And I think that whether or not if you're a teacher in the classroom, that's a really tough reality. You're a teacher who is teaching remotely from home. That's also brings its own difficulties as well. And so, and a lot of what I'm going to share, I'm pretty sure other people would share as well. But one thing that I would definitely say is, this is something that I hear all the time from the mental health provider that I work with, which has been great, is making sure that you're taking time for yourself. And that means after a certain, and it's so hard to do. Totally get it. I totally understand, in a world where we are like connected by the hip to devices, where people expect instantaneous replies, or you have a certain amount of hours to get back to me before X, Y, and Z.
Yep.
It can be very difficult, but I think it's important to draw some lines. One thing that's really important for me, because I work from home, so literally I never leave my working environment. And that can be really, really difficult sometimes. Oh, somebody just emailed me. I could just sneak into the other room really quickly, even though it's dinner time and I really should be present for my family. It's never going to end unless you draw a line. And you're the only one that can hold that line. And so that's the first thing I would say, is you got to set aside time for what's good for you or what you need to do. If it's family that expect you to be present after a day work, great. If it's that you just really need time to decompress, read a book, play a video game, go on a hike and outside, whatever it is, you need to make sure you're doing that, because eventually, if you don't, it will impact the work that you do. And it won't matter how much time you spend doing the work, you will get worse and worse and the quality will go down. We know that. It's the same thing that I would say to students too. Go home and get a good night's sleep. Don't watch Netflix until 2 a.m. because you're going to come in tired and you will not have actually given your body what it needs. The other thing that I would say strategy wise, and I kind of talked a little bit more about it, but I watched this. There's a great TED Talk recently. It was a TED Talk that was given by a soccer referee. And he gave this really great TED Talk where he talked about a very simple way to kind of de-stress and detach yourself. Who better than a soccer referee to teach us how not to take things personally or how to not be affected by outside stressors, right? Like, it seemed like the perfect way. And so what he said was that he basically says to himself, when somebody comes at him hot, when he encounters a situation that's very stressful, when he feels himself getting really amped up or sad or whatever it is, the first question I have to ask is this really about me? Is it something else that's affecting you? Is it something else going on? Is it really something that I have done? Or am I just kind of inserting myself into your stress and assuming that I am the reason? That can be really bad. Then the second thing he says is if he can't figure that out, he says, well, maybe this is about me, meaning maybe he is internalizing it. He is interpreting it as now I've done something wrong. It's both sides of the coin where he first has to figure out, is this person coming at me because of their thing? Or am I feeling like this person is coming at me because of my thing? It was really kind of awesome that it seems really simplistic, but I really came away thinking to myself, like, this is really a great thinking tool that I should be using every single time I'm feeling amped up about something. Is this about some person's issues, or am I putting this on myself and it has nothing to do with me?
Yeah, I like that. I'll definitely include a link to it. And the first part that you had said of like the value in disconnecting and like not getting notifications and whatnot, I imagine that there might be some CS educators like, yeah, but I'm in CS education. It's really hard to do that. We have to be connected, blah, blah, blah. I recommend they check out works by like Cal Newport. So like Deep Work. He also had a book called Digital Minimalism, and then a more recent book called World Without Email. He is a CS professor, I believe, at Georgetown University, and he's constantly preaching like, hey, you don't need social media. Hey, you don't need phone notifications. You don't need to check your email like every 10 minutes, etc. So people can go there to dive a little bit deeper into that.
Sounds like an awesome resource.
What do you feel is holding back educators, and what can we do about it?
How do I answer that question without going into like one of those like 60s style rants, the system, man? I mean, I think there is a certain amount of truth to that, that there are certain structural barriers that make change very hard that education has, notwithstanding the fact that it's an incredibly difficult time to be an educator. I mean, it really is. I have a little bit of perspective on this, as I'm sure you do as well, because you probably talk to a lot of people from all over the country, as I get to do as well, which I feel very fortunate to be able to have a job that lets me do that, because there are three things that I hear from every teacher. Number one, this is the most difficult year ever for me. And it doesn't matter if it's their second year or their 22nd year. I hear that from so many people, that this is the most difficult year that they've ever had. Even more difficult when we had to pivot to online, which blows my mind a little bit. But the more and more I hear it, the more and more I believe it. The second thing I hear over and over again is that they are so happy to be back in person, even if they've got all these weird distancing kind of things that they're having to deal with, or health concerns, even if it's not like quote unquote normal school as they remember it. They're just happy that they're back, for the majority of them, not everybody, but the ones that are back in person are so grateful that they're back in person, and they're willing to do so much to stay there.
Yep.
So you have this time where they're like, it's so difficult, but I so don't want to go backwards. Those are two things that I think about a lot when I answer like, what's holding educators back? I think one of the things, and I'll see if I can kind of develop this a little bit more, but one of the things that I think a lot about is we just went through a period of educational history where we were pushed to reinvent, to rethink, we did in a short amount of time so much to think outside of the box and reinvent so many aspects of education that it kind of blows my mind sometimes. And I can think about big, huge, like rethinking, well, do we really need our students to be in person all of the time? Or is it better for some of them to maybe not be in a classroom with 29 other peers that can easily distract them? Big things like that, all the way down to, like, there was this teacher that I worked with at my old school who swore up and down that I would never, ever, ever get an iPad in her hands. Like, she was like, I love you, James. I think you're great. You could not ever get me to pick up that iPad and use it in my classroom. And as soon as we pivoted to online, she realized, well, this is actually going to really help my students. And she did. Like, that's a micro example, but to me, that was like the most earth-shattering thing I ever saw, that like this teacher who wasn't really a technophobe, she just really felt that this was not something that she needed and wasn't interested in learning about it, was able to turn the corner on something like that. To me, that blew my mind. We had all of these experiences, all of these things that we did, new stuff that we never tried before. Systems were broken apart to make these accommodations. But a lot of people, once they got back in the classroom, went back to exactly what they were doing before. They were like, well, I'm back in class, so I'm going to throw away all of these online resources, all of these asynchronous lessons that I put together, all these ideas I had around differentiation through technology, or the power of being able to like Skyping in or bringing in these outside experts to my students. That's all going to go out the window, because thank God we're back to normal. And I think that's what's holding us back, because we had this moment where we kind of like got a glimpse of what education could be.
Yep.
And I know some people are definitely doing a great job of saying, we're holding on to this, we're not going to let go of it. But I think the vast majority of folks are just glad that they're back in person and they're kind of like covering themselves up with that comfy, cozy blanket. And I get it. I don't shame anybody who wanted to just go back to the way the things were. I mean, I would love to forget the last couple of years. Like, who would? But I think it's a disservice to not really ask yourself, like, everything that I did, everything I experienced, what the value, like what things have value and what things don't, that I can bring in and continue making a part of my practice.
Yeah, and taking the time, even now, to just reflect on what worked, what didn't, what would be an ideal that could continue to strive for and whatnot. I think that's extremely valuable. How do you practice or iterate on your own abilities in education?
That's a great one. One thing I definitely do, and I feel like I have a leg up in this situation, is that I get to go and learn alongside teachers from all different parts of the country and all different places. So like one day I might be working with New York City public school teachers. The next day I might be working with a little rural school in Iowa that only has dial up and K-8 are all in one classroom, like old style prairie schools. And when I go in, I immediately start trying to dial into what are they doing that I can bring with me and share with the next group. When I introduce myself at the beginning of these workshops, I always say, I'm here to learn alongside you. And sometimes I get like, okay, but it really is true, because it's kind of shocking the amount of things that I've learned about, or the amount of tools that strategies that I bring with me that I can take and be like, wow, that's really helpful and that's really awesome. Or it's something as simple as just like, hey, I've got this piece of work that I'm working on. I've got this blog post that I wrote. I'd love you to read it and give me your perspective, because it's so different from other people. So always being open to being willing to learn, and never really saying that, like, I might have expertise in this room, but I'm not the only expert in this room. Like there are some people that I go into that are like, their 50th, 55th, 60th year as educators. They know things that I don't even know exist. And I need to really be open to that. So being kind of open to saying like, okay, I am an expert in this room in some areas, but I am not the only expert in this room. And I know that sometimes people in professional development, they get kind of in that, like, kind of assume that they know everything about everything and they're not willing to learn from the people in the room. It's such a missed opportunity. It's such a missed opportunity.
Right. So the next question that I'm asking, I imagine that there's somebody who's listening to this interview who might be currently doing research or be interested in doing research down the road. And I'm hoping that the answers to this question when I ask it will help inspire future research. So that being said, what do you wish there was more research on that could inform your own practices?
One thing that I really wish there was more research about was the educational value, or the outcomes that can be expected from focusing learning around places that have resources, learning resources that you just can't get in a classroom. There is some, but what I'm specifically looking at is, if I'm a classroom teacher and I haven't been a part of a pre-service program that partnered me with an outside educational agency like a museum or like a park or like some sort of nature-based learning environment, what are the benefits to me and why should I make sure to do it? And then, of course, the other part of that is, and this is the part that I'm focused on, is either as the classroom teacher or as the outside educational resource, how do I talk in a way that the other entity understands, the other organization understands? Because a lot of times what I've learned is that folks that work in informal education have very little idea what goes on in the classroom unless they came from there. And folks in the classroom have absolutely no idea what goes on or how the education works in those other spaces.
Right.
And I think that there is a lot both sides can learn from each other. And so that's kind of the focus of my work right now. And I can tell you, because I've done the lit review, there's very, very little about the educational value of these outside spaces or the kinds of outcomes that we can expect that's been done recently or in the US. There's good evidence from other countries that have these kind of nature-based or experiential models that they've gone, like Scandinavia and places like that. But there's not a lot here. And I feel like it's a huge missed opportunity, especially since, like we said, we've kind of reevaluated everything that we thought of when it came to education. Why can't we reevaluate that learning benefits from not just being inside four walls? Or that some students will benefit greatly, some students may not benefit as much. I feel like that really needs to be considered more by a wider group of people. There's a small group that gets why that's important and they understand the value. I wish that It was just the way things were done. And it was a part of everybody's pre-service program. But I think that's a place that we could really move the needle forward.
Yeah, I appreciate that answer. I'll include a link to this in the show notes, but there's an interview that I did with Grant Smith where he talks about that. So he's a former colleague when I was teaching in Avondale who's now working in more like after school and informal spaces and whatnot. Do you have any questions for myself or for the field?
I'm always interested in who else is interested in these same things. I feel like a lot of the things that I'm into are kind of an island unto themselves. So I always love getting connected to other people. A lot of the writing I do on my website focuses around the idea of teaching more like a ranger and this idea of informal education practices being brought into the classroom. If any of that resonates with folks, or if there's people that you think in specific that kind of stuff would resonate with, I always love to be connected with them, mostly because number one, I want to see what they're doing, but number two, I love to hear what they think about the work and just kind of get their perspectives as well. So
yeah, I like that. There's over like 100 and some odd episodes released now. So the show notes include links to like prior guests and prior episodes to try and synthesize and like collate. Here are some more people who are talking about similar ideas and whatnot. So hopefully the show notes are helpful for people.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you.
Where might people go to connect with you and the organizations that you work with?
Awesome. Well, as previously mentioned, definitely go to pblworks.org to find out a lot of great resources and stuff that I mentioned are there. You can check them out and you can learn more about how to work with them if you want to get some training and how to open up your own PBL practice. My own website, Fester EDU, and that's a great place to go and connect with me. I always love to hear from people, even if it's just, hey, heard your interview, it was great. I love hearing that. But if people want to hear a little bit more, be connected to more of the work I do, that's great as well. And then I'm going to, of course, shamelessly plug the book that my friend George and I just wrote. So it's Environmental Science for grades 6 through 12, which is published by ISTE and I believe starts shipping, probably already shipping, if not by the time that people hear this, but it's out and you can get it on Amazon or at ISTE's website. And I would love for people to check that out because I think that would be really helpful. Anybody, not just science teachers, but anybody who's interested in environmental science and saving the planet, definitely check it out.
And with that, that concludes this week's episode of the CSKA podcast. Make sure you check out the show notes at jaredoleary.com to access all the links that we mentioned. If you enjoyed this particular episode, consider sharing with somebody else or leaving a review on whatever app you're listening to this on. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you stay tuned for next week's episode. And until then, I hope you're all staying safe and are having a wonderful week.